Welcome to this short introduction on the impact of trauma and stress on the brain and its impact for learning. My name is Sharon Lambert and I'm a psychologist in UCC. I have spent a long number of years working with young people and their families in the community, and I became very interested on why some young people find it harder to engage in services than others. As you can see from the picture of our brain, if you focus on section 1, this is our old brain, and that was the first part of our brain to develop as human beings when we were evolving. This is called the reptilian brain sometimes, and it's the part of the brain that deals with your intrinsic responses and your instinctive responses, so fight and flight. Part 2 of our brain, which you can see on the slide, is our emotional brain. This is the part of the brain that perceives and reacts to threat, and it's our emotional energy and memory. Part 3 is our thinking brain. This is the most important part of our brain when we're dealing with education and students. This is the part of the brain that allows you to analyse, problem solve, learn from experience, plan ahead, and understand consequences. And all of these parts of the brain are constantly working all of the time, and they're required to work in harmony together in order for us to be as productive as we can be. But what happens when there's barriers to learning? So some young people and some children can be exposed to trauma or stress. And when I say trauma, it doesn't always necessarily mean big traumatic experiences. So when we think about that, what's the definition of trauma? Psychological trauma is the unique individual experience of an event or enduring condition in which the individual's ability to integrate his or her emotional experience is overwhelmed, or the individual experiences subjectively a threat to life, bodily integrity, or sanity. And the important word there is subjective. A massive study conducted in the United States of over 17,000 people discovered that most of the general population will have about 2 traumatic experiences in our childhoods. And why does subjective matter? Because some of us have more resilience to cope with those traumas. For others, those traumas become deeply embedded in the old brain and the emotional brain, and it draws energy and resources away from the thinking brain or the frontal lobe. And that has consequences for our ability to engage and our ability to learn. So when psychologists talk about trauma and stress, what exactly are they talking about? What are the types of trauma? So sometimes when you use the word trauma, people can think about very traumatic experiences, and certainly they're in there: abuse, neglect, exposure to violence. Then there's other events that happen to all of us in life: the loss of a loved one, experiences of bullying or isolation, experiences of a medical illness, or prolonged period in hospital, or exposure to an accident. These are all types of traumas. Most of us will experience some of them, but for some people, it is very difficult to have the resilience in order to manage those traumas. Being exposed to those traumas has an impact on the brain. It affects the way that the brain develops. There's been major advances in neuroscience in the last 20 years, and we know more about the brain now than we ever did before. So, for example, we know that if you're exposed to traumatic stress or you're living in a traumatic environment in your first 3 years, it has a big impact on the way in which your brain wires. So your fight and flight responses are very highly active and very highly attuned, and they're scanning the environment for threat. So how can that present in somebody? You can have somebody who's very hyper-aroused, so they can be aggressive in the fight and flight stage. They can appear unwilling to engage rather than unable to engage. You can also see the opposite, where you have somebody who's hypo-aroused. So that means they become withdrawn, they can appear unmotivated, depressed, and just totally disengaged. And those are actually normal experiences as a result of experiencing stress and trauma in your life, where your body is trying to protect you and tell you that you're in danger. The types of behaviours that you might commonly see are flashbacks, anxiety, insomnia, avoidance, an enhanced startle response. So somebody hears a loud noise and they become hypervigilant. Anger and rage, irritability, mistrust, helplessness, and apathy. So these are all the signs and symptoms of somebody whose brain is in fight and flight mode. And it's interesting that for some people, they can be quite outwardly aggressive signs and symptoms, and for others, they can become turned in. It's important for us to think about this when we're working with young people who might have experienced stress and trauma. It might be what we would consider to be very serious trauma, or it might be normal life with stressful events. But for some of those children, they're unable to cope with and manage their responses. And when thinking about those children, the kind of things that you're thinking about is, what am I doing in my environment when I'm working with young people that could possibly trigger one of those responses? The triggers for stress responses can be being overloaded, having to wait, being surprised, being alone, disappointed, being happy, being unhappy. The list is endless and totally subjective. If we think back to the first slide on the brain and the different stages, we need to think about the impact of that on learning. So if a young person comes to your class and something has happened on the way up the stairs, coming in the door, opening the class door that has triggered a stress response for this young person, all of the blood that's required to fire all of the engines in the front part of the brain that deals with learning and ability to concentrate and plan ahead and learn from consequences, that blood starts to withdraw slightly back into the middle emotional brain, and it's all being pumped by the fight or flight response. So the young person loses the ability to engage rationally, because everything in their being and everything in their brain is telling them there's something dangerous in this environment, and it's quite an unconscious process. But what they have is their heart rate is increased, their blood pressure is up, they have a feeling, and that feeling might be anger, frustration, fear, annoyance, and all their body and brain is telling them to do is that they need to get out of there, and they need to get out of there quickly. And their ability then to think about logically what has happened. It was just a bang downstairs. My heart rate is increased. That's why I'm feeling like that. That's not the way it works. What actually happens is they become engaged in either an argument with their tutor, or else they just leave the building. So they either fight or they flight, but the opportunity to learn is gone. So what's a good state for learning? So one way we can think about a good state for learning is we all have what we call a window of tolerance. So when you're at your best physiological and psychological self, your heart rate is normal, your blood pressure is normal, all parts of your brain are working as best as they can possibly be, you're emotionally, physically and psychologically well, and you can think. You have the freedom and the space to think, and you can think about being curious and about learning and analysing information that you're getting and problem solving. However, for some learners, that window of tolerance is a little bit smaller, and they spend a lot of time in hypoarousal, which is at the top of the graph, or hyperarousal at the top of the graph and hypoarousal at the bottom of the graph. So why do we need to think about that as teachers? If young people are coming to our classes and they're hyperaroused or hypoaroused, they're not in a good state for learning. There is no point in us pulling out the books and saying, come on, let's sit down here and do some maths or some English, because that part of the brain that's required in order to engage with the material is not working. The blood has left that part and fight or flight is enacted, and it's going to end up in either conflict or avoidance. So one of the ways to think about managing states for learning is observing. So how is the student today? Do they appear hyper-aroused or hypo-aroused? Are they in a good state for learning? And what could I do in order to bring them back into their window of tolerance? So thinking about relaxation exercises, or maybe just giving somebody some space. So finally, when we think about responding and thinking about young people that we might work with who have been exposed to normal stress or quite serious trauma, irrespective of whether it was normal stress or whether it was very severe trauma, the young person has experienced it subjectively. That has had an impact on the way in which their brain has wired. It has an impact on their ability to engage. It has an impact on their window of tolerance. So we should take responsibility for acknowledging that. And when we observe a young person who's coming into an educational setting, and we should think about what way are they presenting. Are there triggers in our building? Are there triggers in the way that we're talking? Are there triggers in the way that we're engaging that is setting off an automatic response in the brain that the young person is totally unaware of, but they are now in fight and flight response? So their body tells them there's danger. It might be a name that they've heard, a song, a touch, a taste, a smell. Something that the brain recognizes and associates with a former stress, and it tells the body, you're in danger. You need to go into fight or flight. You need to get out of here, and you need to disengage. By thinking about trauma-informed teaching, what we're thinking about is being aware and knowing about the impact of stress and trauma on the brain, on thinking about the behaviour of the young person. Is this a behavioural response as a result of fight and flight? So rather than thinking about the young person being unwilling to engage, thinking about them being unable to engage. If we think about the behaviours that we find difficult to work with, aggression and avoidance, if we think about those as not a part of the person, but actually a symptom, a very useful adaptive system that has said to a person, you need to get out of here. It's actually quite a useful and adaptive response. It's just not what was needed now, today, in the class. Nevertheless, it's there. We have to deal with it. We have to separate that symptom from the person and use all of our resources in order to try and help that young person get back into their window of tolerance. So by being trauma-informed and using strengths, taking away the behaviour from the young person and seeing them as signs and symptoms, and actually is quite useful adaptive responses, and thinking about how you can work with the young person, getting them back into their window of tolerance so that they can feel safe and secure. All of the brain can function properly, together, coherently, and then they are able to engage, they're able to learn, they're able to problem solve. Thank you very much for listening to my short talk today. I hope it has given you something to think about.